CEO of the Washington International Trade Association. We are delighted you could join us here today for this panel on digital public infrastructure. We're pleased to be able to bring this conversation to the WTO. WITA is a membership organization for the international trade community. We are based in Washington, D.C., but we have members all around the world, and we hope you'll consider being part of our trade community. We have a fantastic panel assembled here today. Ambassador Tan Hung Sen, the permanent representative of the Republic of Singapore to the World Trade Organization. Emmanuelle, the Chief of Digital Trade and Frontier Technologies of the World Trade Organization. Kyle Johnson, Senior Director of Trade Policy for the Information Technology Industry Council. Dr. Patty Sumanen, founder and CEO of the Next Trade Group. And I'm proud to welcome our moderator, Ambassador Maria Ganne, former U.S. Ambassador to the World Trade Organization. Maria?
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you for everybody who's here. I am really delighted to be moderating this session on something that is somewhat new to me. Got down various rabbit holes in recent days on the internet. But I know it's a very important issue, and this is a great opportunity to do some learning and some conversations. I asked ChatGPT for what was the first reference to digital public infrastructure in its database, and it came back as occurring in 2012 in an article from the Open Knowledge Foundation, which discussed public digital infrastructure. But the phrase didn't really emerge until the late 2010s and early 2020s. Now, today we're here talking about it, and again, went down various rabbit holes, have seen it described in multiple ways. So I'm gonna start with a very basic question for our panelists, which is, what is it, and why should we care? I'm gonna start with Ambassador Tan, unless you don't want to answer that question.
Happy to. Well, thank you very much, Ken, for the invitation. And I can't say no to Maria. I think that's a good question to start off or to kick off our discussion here this afternoon. My understanding of digital public infrastructure is that it constitutes the software layer that provides the foundation for digital transactions to be conducted seamlessly and securely across borders. So the operative words here are seamlessly and securely. In Singapore, we refer to it as foundational digital infrastructure because the systems are foundational and they must be end-to-end in order to allow different users, different solutions, and different devices to interact with each other in an inclusive and interoperable manner. This is important because taking such an approach will enable digital services to reach more people and businesses at lower cost and greater convenience. Such infrastructure or digital infrastructure will complement and supplement physical infrastructure such as broadband and mobile networks and data centers. In Singapore, 4 pillars underpin our digital public infrastructure, and the objective is to enable end-to-end digital transactions. And these 4 pillars are: 1, to have digital identity; 2, authorization and consent; 3, invoicing and payments; and 4, data exchange. So this would be how I and how Singapore would interpret, we call it digital public infrastructure. Thank you.
Patty, would you like to add or give your own definition of digital public infrastructure?
I think the ambassador alluded to that it's definitely about these interoperable open systems, as the G20 has also discussed it, and commonly referred to in digital ID systems, digital payment systems, data exchange systems that then enable these very interoperable, seamless economic transactions.
Emmanuelle.
Sure, so let me add to what was said and not repeat. To me, DPI is important because it's an approach of globalization that focuses not only on the what, when it's built, but how you build it and how you build it for scale. And how do you build it for scale? Actually, the acronym DPI can be used to define the different characteristics of what it should be, what are the key characteristics of DPI. First, P, it should be a public good, so for the public benefit. The I, it should be inclusive, and that was mentioned. So the inclusiveness dimension is very important. It should be interoperable, that's one dimension that is very important. And the D, to me, is also important. It should be a dynamic concept. Why dynamic? Because the tech landscape evolves extremely rapidly. We launched this morning the Water Report on Trade and AI. AI opens tremendous opportunities, but it also raises new challenges. These have to be taken into account when DPI solutions are being built. Or blockchain, the European Union put in place the ETSI, the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure. That is a public sector infrastructure to promote the use of this technology. So I think this notion of dynamism is also very important.
Some very interesting things I've been hearing so far that I have already a bunch of questions on, but Kyle, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I would just add a few things. I think one is just, so agree with everything that's already been said. There have been some attempts, such as the G20, to define this and come up with a consensus approach on this, and I think it's helpful. Agree on the focus of the definition is not just on what is DPI, but how is that structured, how should it be structured. I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about it. I think the other thing I would just add to the conversation at this point is, it seems to me that a lot of times when people are talking about DPI or considering that, they're talking about specific use cases or applications. And so DPI is this specific service that's provided in this market. That seems to be how it's discussed often. But as has been pointed out, it's really what we're talking about is a much broader concept that could be used in a lot of different ways. And so right now DPI might be these 10 applications in this market, but in 5 years it could be completely different applications. So it's a dynamic concept. It's scalable, and there's reliance on shared infrastructure, I think, at the core. So I would just add that to the discussion.
That's some risk here because I am not totally technologically inadequate, but I am trying to separate the what from, I guess, from the how, and I don't know if there's other ways of explaining this for people like me who, I recently was trying to sign up for a e-banking service and completely failed miserably and deleted the whole thing. Again, just trying to see, you, Emmanuelle, hit on the issue of a public good. Like, how do we separate these things out in terms of, are these government-run things, or are these just things that governments enable the ecosystem to foster so that you have more players? Maybe that's not a very precise question, but I am trying to disentangle some of these concepts that you guys have raised, and whoever wants to go first, if it makes any sense. Go ahead.
Okay, let me try to answer your question on the how. And not only the what. So it's not only about, for example, putting in place a digital identity system. It's about making sure that it builds on open standards, open specifications, so that it can be built upon. Singapore has actually a very interesting experience. I don't know whether Ambassador Tan wants to speak to it. But the open attestation system that they put in place has been used in Cambodia, in Laos PDR, in Vietnam. So the idea of making sure that it builds on open standards and specifications is very important one. We mentioned already interoperability, which is also about the how. And we can come back to it when we talk about the cross-border dimension, because to me, this notion of interoperability in a cross-border context is critical. A number of DPI systems have been put in place at the national level with a sort of national interoperability in mind. If we want DPI to be useful in an international trade context, we have to design them with international trade in mind, or a global approach to it. And so when it comes to digital identity of businesses, for example, this is critical. Now, to your point about whether it should be government-led, whether there are other actors, there are different configurations. The private sector plays a critical role in developing DPI solutions, and I think what is important is to have this multi-stakeholder approach. So it can be initiated by the government, but this public-private partnership is critical. If you look at Estonia and how they put in place their digital identity system, they work very closely with the private sector, and they put in place in a record time because they had this strong connection with the private sector and really worked with them jointly. So this multi-stakeholder approach is very important. But there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Yes.
Before I go to you, because I want to talk about what's important. Anything else, Kati or Kyle want to add for now, or?
Can I just add a little bit to what has been said about the importance of public-private collaboration? I think to your question on whether it is government or private sector, my short answer would be that it has to be both. And here, governments would have to design and innovate together with the private sector. So governments can provide the enabling infrastructure and regulatory guardrails. These would include systems that must allow banks, fintech companies, and other service providers to innovate on top of it. So let me share an example of how this has worked in Singapore. It starts with the government developing open attestation, which is an open source framework to simplify the issuance and verification of digital documents using blockchain technology. And building on this, the government and the private sector partners, such as traders and fintech platforms, then develop trade trusts. So open attestation, the government then worked with the private sector to develop trade trust, which enables the digitization of trade documents into electronic transferable records. And lastly, using trade trust, three companies, Exxon Mobil, who is the shipper, together with Bunker Chain, which is the trade trust enabled digital platform provider, and VLK Traders, which is the vessel owner, executed in 2023 the world's first fully paperless live shipment of liquid chemicals to Thailand using an electronic transferable record, which, for those of you who do not know, is the equivalent document of a physical bill of lading. So what this pilot project demonstrated was how businesses can benefit from increased efficiency and cost savings through interoperable systems that are designed and developed by government in collaboration with the private sector. So this is just one example of how digital public infrastructure can be developed. First, with government taking the lead, and then working in collaboration with the private sector to bring it to fruition.
If I can add something to what was just said, one thing that is very important to keep in mind is that DPI does not operate in vacuum. It's more than tech. You need laws and regulations. So we just mentioned electronic transferable records. It is important to have legislation in place to allow a legal recognition of electronic transferable records if you want DPI to be effective. You need legislation on e-signatures as well, which are more and more integrated into digital identity systems. So I think that dimension is critically important, which goes back to the role of government and the importance of public-private sector collaboration. The government does have a key role to play, but obviously the private sector is also a critical stakeholder.
Can I add to that as well?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so just to say, I think when we're thinking about public-private partnerships, I completely agree that that is essential in effective and sustainable DPI anywhere. I think there's something to be said as well for the potential of that collaboration to happen in the development of the DPI infrastructure itself in some cases, so that there are different models and approaches, as we've already mentioned a few times. One benefit, right, of working with industry, with private sector in the development of the actual infrastructure, not just on the applications that rely on that infrastructure, is you have companies with expertise from operating around the world, right? And they're addressing some of these same issues and concerns that a government would have to address in the context of deploying and developing DPI. So to name some examples in the technology space, cybersecurity, privacy, those are top of mind issues all around the world, right? And companies that are operating around the world have that expertise. They have access to best practices, kind of best-in-class technologies and solutions to address these issues. So I think there's something to be said for more broader, or a broader view on kind of public-private partnerships and how essential that is in structuring this. And obviously this point I'm making is not DPI specific. I could say the same about a number of technology areas, but it's worth pointing out that that model and that benefits, they still apply in the DPI context.
Yeah, I think it's these systems are quite nascent, so there's a lot of empirical work that has to be still done to be made to understand which kinds of governance models or design features are most conducive to the success of DPIs. And I think we also want to think about what are we going for here with DPIs. What are the success driver or the successes that we're looking for? And I would say one is the uptake of, are these systems being taken up by consumers, including the lower income consumers. The second is, are they trustworthy? Do they work as expected? Is there a lot of fraud? Is there outages, things like that? Or do they actually deliver consistent service? Third, do we have consumer choice? That consumers are able to choose from a variety of services, whether they are DPIs or private sector services or what have you, in the economy. And then this interoperability is really critical, that the systems come together, what Singapore has really championed, this seamless whole, and promote further innovation. So, I think we want to have those goalposts in mind, and then think about what are the success drivers, as we've been talking about several of them. I would say one key success driver is also to have affinity for digital services and payments. You can't just drop a DPI in the market and expect that there'll be a great use of digital identity or digital payments. You need to build that digital literacy. We've actually seen through empirical work that economies where, for instance, digital payments have been used or cards have been used widely are the ones where DPIs is then taken up, including by different segments of the population. I would say another success driver is that you have a variety of services that consumers can choose from. We did some work looking at payment systems, for instance, and saw that what we would brand DPIs have been used by consumers for kind of smaller and local transactions, oftentimes groceries, gas, things like that. Where, for instance, cards have been more widely used are larger and global transactions. When consumers travel, they trust that those global networks. When they are buying larger appliances, washing machines or stereos or things like that, they like the access to finance. So I think it's important for us to recognize that we shouldn't only drive a certain model, that there's a number of competing solutions that have different competitive advantages for consumers. And then I think on the governance and design of these RTP systems, these are quite nascent, so the empirical work has to still happen as to what kinds of governance models. We know that there are some models where, for instance, the central bank owns and operates a payment system while also being the regulator of the payment ecosystem. And to me, this is a little bit concerning. We don't know yet what the outcomes are. This has to play out a little bit longer, I think. But there are certain elements that give me a little bit of concern, some conflicts of interest, and perhaps some unlevel playing fields where governments may be championing one model over the other. So what I would go for in order to get to those successes are kind of competition. Let consumers choose what's the best for them, best method, and then precisely what was mentioned, kind of promote that cooperation also, building private sector solutions from the beginning, but also promote cooperation. We know that, for instance, global payment networks have great advantages on fraud prevention on cross-border payments, whereas these are areas where RTPs have perhaps yet to succeed. So there's also opportunities there to promote this collaboration between the systems.
Thank you. So now we've already mentioned that Singapore seems to be at the forefront of this. No surprise, since Ambassador Tan is Mr. Digital Trade here at the WTO. So, tell us about what the government of Singapore has been doing and what lessons can other WTO members draw from your approach to building secure and inclusive PPI systems.
Happy to do so, Maria. Let me just share 3 key takeaways from Singapore's experience in the digital transformation journey. First lesson is that government must invest to ensure that digital transformation is inclusive as possible, so that no one is left behind. This is more than just a slogan. We have put in a lot of effort and resources to ensure that our systems are designed to be user-friendly. They use plain language to help every citizen access and use digital services. For example, the government runs free training programs that send volunteers, we call them digital ambassadors, to teach the elderly as well as MSMEs how to use smartphones and other internet tools so that they can safely utilize e-payments and online government services. The government also subsidizes devices and internet plans for vulnerable groups such as low-income residents, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. These measures, we found, have been extremely helpful in helping Singapore achieve nearly universal home broadband coverage and high digital literacy. This in turn enables citizens to trust and effectively use systems that are built on Singapore's digital public infrastructure. The second lesson that Singapore has learned is that we must invest early in robust digital infrastructure that people trust. This infrastructure must be underpinned by the 4 pillars that I had mentioned earlier, but let me provide a bit more elaboration on each of them. So, the first pillar, the creation of a digital identity. This would help to establish trust at both ends of the digital interaction. In Singapore, each citizen has a national digital identity, which we call SingPass. This provides secure and convenient access to over 2,700 services across 800 government agencies and businesses, and is used by 5 million people. This means that Singaporeans, we can access our health records, pay our bills, open bank accounts online, just as safely as doing all these tasks in person. For instance, during the pandemic, a Singaporean could apply online for COVID assistance without submitting physical documents, as government agencies simply share and verify the data behind the scenes. The second pillar is to make it easy and reliable to obtain authorization and consent. This helps to foster public confidence that digital transactions are safe and secure. To do this, we have mechanisms for individual consent to ensure that the use of data is properly authorized. Again, taking SingPass as an example, before any data is released to SingPass, Singaporeans need to choose and explicitly authorize the sharing of the data with service providers on an app which is called SingPass Mobile. The third pillar is to ensure the interoperability of payments. This is extremely important. because we need to facilitate payments across multiple payment solutions. For example, Singapore's retail payments infrastructure includes PayNow, which allows the transfer of money between bank accounts and e-wallets in Singapore in real time and at zero cost, regardless of which bank the money is deposited in and using just their mobile phone numbers or identity numbers. The fourth pillar is to ensure or to enable secure data exchange, as individuals and businesses must be able to digitally access all their relevant data and make them available to third-party service providers. Take, for example, the Singapore Financial Data Exchange. This is a digital platform that helps Singaporeans consolidate their financial information from banks, insurers, and government agencies into one single comprehensive view of financial planning. This exchange again uses SingPass, so you see the foundational importance of a national digital identity to securely authenticate user access and grant the relevant permissions for financial institutions and government agencies to retrieve that information. So these are the four pillars that are essential. And the third takeaway from our experience is to ensure that our digital public infrastructure is regulated and supported by clear rules, a point that you have just made, Emmanuelle. For instance, Singapore will soon introduce a Digital Infrastructure Act this year. This will regulate important digital infrastructure such as major cloud service providers and data center operators. This will complement our existing legislation such as the Cyber Security Act to safeguard Singapore's digital public infrastructure. These regulations allow Singaporeans to trust that their personal data and digital transactions are kept safe and secure, and this in turn leads to greater confidence. It leads to more frequent and widespread use of digital services. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I need one of these digital ambassadors to help me set up my digital issues. You know, I have a question for each one of you, but this issue of the security of the data and I mean, we all know there's at least every month I get an email from some service that I've used telling me that there's been a data breach. I just got one recently from Park Mobile, you know, when you park your cars in Washington, D.C. And I get $1. I get $1 that I can use. Anyway, that's another matter. As a settlement for the breach, which, I don't know, that's like, what, 15 minutes parking on the street? But anyway, so this issue of this, you know, of course, part of this is the ability to securely exchange data, but when, and again, maybe I'm phrasing this wrong, if it's, whether it's the government or private entities that have your data and you're exchanging it with, again, the whole point is that you're exchanging it with multiple, you know, the banks and the government and whatever other systems are set up. Any comments on, you know, is this creating more vulnerabilities from the security and data privacy perspective, or is this just the same as we're facing right now? You know, again, when we have these issues of data breaches from whether it's the credit card companies or Park Mobile or whoever. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think it goes exactly to the point that Emmanuelle was also making, the ambassadors. It depends on how the system is built, right, and secured both through laws as well as both through the technology. What we've seen in some of the empirical work that we've done on exactly on what the ambassador was alluding to, kind of interoperable digital IDs that interoperate with public sector solutions and private sector solutions, and Singapore, of course, being the really a shining example of what a digital identity can enable. We've seen that there is a correlation between those economies. There's about 62 of them that have this interoperable digital identity, and then the design features that they have legal redress, they have transparency, court oversight of the digital ID system. All these design features that are very important for consumers to trust it and the system to work, for consumers to have some requests as you had. And then of course have the enabling environment, as Emmanuelle was also alluding to, that there is the data privacy regulations, there's the consumer protection, there's cybersecurity, all these elements that G20 was highlighting already in 2023 as the fundamental kind of pillars of the DPIs that need to be in place in order for these systems to hold and enable these various use cases that Singapore has so successfully done, for instance. And then there's of course once we get systems like this going, there's really an opportunity also for that cross-border interoperability, something that the EU is now building a continental digital ID wallet, as I understand, and lots of great use cases also in Latin America on interoperable cross-border uses of digital identity between Brazil and Uruguay, for instance. Colombia has a Cédula Digital, I think it's called, that interoperates with public services in like 8 Latin American countries. So there's a lot of opportunity for this, but obviously we need to get things right at the domestic level first in order for citizens to trust these systems and then build that interoperability.
Any other?
I would add 2 points to this. I think one is certainly this is an important issue for technology generally. Cybersecurity and data security are fundamental, and as I mentioned earlier, these are core ideas and concerns for industry and for governments around the world, and rightfully so. I think it's worth noting that technology, both as a driver of some of the risk, right? Of the increased use of technology does increase potential risk for these kind of things. Maybe you park one day and then a few months later you get $1 because of a hack, for your example. At the same time, though, technology can be part of the solution, and I think that's worth reflecting on as well. So the ability to access cutting-edge technologies and best in class and leveraging some of the best practices that companies that are developing technologies around the world, that can help to address these. So you can use technology to also address and minimize these types of risks, and I think that's done in the payment space all the time to cut down on fraud. It's done in a number of contexts. So that's one piece to say. And the other thing is from the trade perspective and related to the WTO, I think there's an opportunity to use trade discussions, trade conversations, to use trade negotiations such as the JSI on e-commerce to talk about how to align approaches on these more fundamental issues. That can have impacts on DPI certainly, but on a lot of other areas. I think that's an important role for the WTO to drive those conversations and to advance policy approaches around the world that help to secure technology and help to address these risks. So I think there's a role for the WTO to be part of the solution here, and trade is, again, part of that solution.
Great, and we're going to get a little bit more into WTO issues in a little bit. I wanted to pose a question to you, Kathy. You've written a number of publications looking at DPI systems all over the world, and you've already given us some examples. What are some of the biggest challenges preventing DPI systems from being successful and sustainable, and what can be done to fix that?
Yeah, big question, right? I think the panel, we've all already talked about some of this. And again, like if I were to look at the other side of the coin, what makes these systems successful, want to think about what Singapore has championed is the uptake at different share segments of the population. Want to think about this consumer choice, the interoperability as really being some of the outcomes that we're all going for with these systems. And then I think the governance is something that we really want to, as the next phase of research into DPIs, whether it's identity systems or payment systems, we really want to focus on that to understand how the different governance models are resulting in different outcomes, and are we hitting these outcomes that we want to with these different models. And I would again say that public-private partnerships and governance kind of bringing the public and private sector together it seems at least superior to having a government operating a system and then regulating it at the same time. and certainly this competition as well in the market, that we don't create unlevel playing fields. We enable competition, and then consumers to choose from the best models, the most resilient models, those models that are kind of fit for purpose, as we would say, for a specific use case that they have, whether it's remittances or e-commerce or larger purchases, whether it's travel. So to me, the success of the whole system for the consumer to have the choice, and consumer to be accessing services that are useful for them for any given use case is really what we're wanting to go for.
Maybe a follow-up question, and also for the other panelists, and maybe this is a little bit of an unfair question, but the issue of consumer choice has come up a couple of times, and it is important. Are there ways of ensuring consumer choice? Are there ways of consumers making sure that their governments are ensuring consumer choice? Again, maybe this is a little bit unfair because it's going to depend on how the systems are set up, but it does seem to be an important issue. In one of the many rabbit holes that I went down on the other day, there's this issue of it's not about creating a monopoly, whether it's a private monopoly or a public monopoly on something, but that is, again, this issue of choice, interoperability, etc. So, again, any further thoughts on how governments, but also on the other side, consumers in the private sector can ensure that the consumer choice aspect of it is integral to any system?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's the other side of the coin of the competition that we're talking about. That governments support kind of open loop, interoperable ecosystem, and enable players to compete, and that in and of itself should open consumers' choice to different kinds of systems that they can access for whatever they need, and small businesses as well, of course, should have the same access. But to me, a lot of the choice comes from the competition that is enabled by the government and the market.
All right. Well, we are at the WTO, so we know that this issue of digital public infrastructure is being discussed, and conversations are happening in other fora, but we are here. So, Emmanuelle, what is the WTO's role in furthering this conversation and ensuring that we are contributing to the development of what do we call them? Successful and sustainable, and open and inclusive DPIs.
Thank you, Maria, for the question. Well, there have been no dedicated discussion on DPIs at the WTO for the time being, although some members have shown interest in exploring the issue at the WTO. We received a submission from India under the Work Program on E-commerce in 2023 that presented DPI indeed as a tool that can help developing countries harness digital transformation. And so in that context, we heard from a number of members. The submission encouraged members to share information on, share experience on DPI and their views on how we can promote electronic commerce. So we heard from a number of members on how they're using DPI or developing the DPI tools, how it can help for e-commerce to provide access to finance or to improve customs processes. We also heard about some of the challenges that they're facing in developing DPIs. But this is pretty much what the only discussion that we've had on this issue at the WTO. Now, what can the WTO do in this area? The WTO can provide a forum where these issues can be discussed, where members can learn from each other by sharing their most successful digital strategies and solutions to develop DPIs. We can also bring together relevant organizations and stakeholders to gather experience and resources, but ultimately it's really for members. We're member driven, so it's for members to decide how they want to move these conversations forward at the WTO, what type of discussions they want to have, whether to the point that we're making there should be discussions and maybe guidelines or more at the WTO. But there is one thing that I would like to note is that in the context of the GSI agreement, as you may know, we have a stabilized text since the summer of last year that is sponsored by 71 members. There are several provisions that are relevant in the DPI context. There's a provision, for example, on personal data protection, which encourages the development of mechanisms promoting compatibility between different personal data regimes, personal data protection regimes. There is also a provision on electronic payments that calls on participants to take into account internationally accepted payment standards to enable greater interoperability. So there are some elements in the GSI text that speak to the issue of DPI, to the point that Kai was making about using the WTO as a forum where we can try and align approaches.
Thank you. Kyle, what are the most critical considerations for ensuring DPI systems are future-proof and globally competitive? As technologies continue to evolve, how should governments and industry collaborate to keep DPI secure and sustainable?
Yeah, and let me start just by plugging and promoting some other aspects of the WTO that I think are relevant to this conversation. I think there's a lot of technology areas, and DPI is one of them, where it seems a lot of people think of it as almost like magic. It just magically appears and there's this solution, right? But the reality of technologies is they are built and powered by physical infrastructure. And I think it's worth noting how important WTO agreements like the Information Technology Agreement, like the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, those are foundational to the development of technology around the world and to these opportunities. So there is no DPI, there's nothing to build on without these kind of enabling environments and approaches. So just want to say kudos and note how important those are for DPI and for everything else. In terms of other approaches and kind of opportunities to talk about this, I think, to me, I see a lot of potential in, the e-commerce work program in the JSI and the future conversation there. I think there's a lot of opportunity to have conversations, maybe at a higher level that's more fundamental, that enables access to technologies and to the competition. So things like, prohibitions on data localization, requirements where possible, addressing regulatory fragmentation. Those kinds of reforms are certainly effective for technology. They're critical. They also are effective in promoting access to the ability to create DPI solutions in the first place. So I think that there's a fair amount that could be done and that the WTO could be focused on. That is, maybe it doesn't have DPI at the top of the paper when you're talking about the solutions, but these elements, are relevant to DPI, and so we're not thinking of something that came out of nowhere. We're thinking of a technology concept that builds on things that existed before and will continue to exist in other areas. So, thinking about it that way, holistically, how can we address the kind of cross-cutting foundational environment is probably a good place to start in the WTO context. But again, let me finish by just noting again how fundamental some of the existing rules and agreements really are at promoting the ability to even be talking about this technology today.
No, that's thank you for adding that, and I had a separate question about that, but we kind of conversation is going in a particular way. But I do think that certainly ITA, the e-commerce moratorium, I would hazard a guess that TRIPS is also very relevant in this area. And obviously on the digital space, negotiations are different or different level. But it is, I think, and even the point that Emmanuelle made, there's both the important legal ecosystem domestically, but then the international legal ecosystem, I'm sure, also helps. And, I think some of you, or maybe all of you, have mentioned, there's the dimension of kind of the domestic, helping with, digital identities, the banking, the using these ecosystems, infrastructure for dealing with stuff at home. But then there's also been the comment, and of course, again, we're at the WTO of then cross-border connectivity. How else can we, foster that to be developed? That does seem to me to be even a bigger challenge than domestic, it's hard enough to get agencies in a government to talk to each other and to allow data, and I know that this is one of, an issue that is always critical, and we, certainly I see it in our government where, this agency has this information, and even though it's the same information that this other agency wants from you, then you have to give it because it has to be in this different thing. Hopefully we can get beyond that. But then I can only imagine that, when you're talking cross-border, then that's even more difficult. So any thoughts, any suggestions on how, we can improve all of that?
Well, I would say this is where the role of an organization like the WTO is important, because we can provide a forum where the different members come together and discuss these issues with cross-border trade, international trade in mind. As I said, many of the DPA solutions that have been developed with national interoperability in mind, sometimes regional. There are some regional projects. So we heard about the EU digital identity wallets. You also have, for example, when it comes to cross-border payments, the PAPS, so the Pan-American Payment Settlement System. So you do have some regional initiatives, but they are the exception rather than the norm. And there are very few discussions at a multilateral level on these issues. And I think if we want DPI to help with cross-border transactions, facilitate cross-border transactions, it's important to have these discussions in a multilateral setting. I wanted to add one point, because we've talked a lot about digital identity. When you look at digital identity in the context of DPI, most of the time this is digital identity of natural persons, of citizens. In an international trade context, what matters more is, or equally, or is very important, is digital identity of businesses. And I think this is a dimension that is not being discussed right now, but interoperability of digital identity for businesses is a very important issue. There are different systems that exist that do not talk to each other, and it's important, I think, to start a discussion on these issues at the WTO.
Any other comments?
Maybe just another trade idea. I was thinking of this earlier today when thinking about the panel, but DPI is not, when we're thinking about trade, it's not just an import issue. It's not just we're getting technology potentially from other countries. There's also the export potential side. So it's worth considering, to the extent that DPI approaches and solutions really take off, and they seem to be spreading in a number of markets. If there are effective and competitive approaches that are developed in a market, and the global trading environment is open, and that companies can compete fairly around the world, there's an export opportunity there. So I think it's not just a loss or using foreign technology. It might be creating an export opportunity for a local company, a local startup. So I think just wanted to add that element that there's a trade side here as well when we're thinking about trade opportunities and export opportunities.
Maybe just to endorse what Emmanuelle was saying about the next phase, which is to support SMEs in getting the digital identity. And of course, there's attempts being made on this around the world. And there's domestic systems already existing in some economies. But then to be able to connect these and create more of a global identifier, really important for customs clearance, trade facilitation, and then for payments, cross-border payments as well, for eKYC, for AML, CTF, and so forth. So definitely we would endorse more conversations around how we can build an SME digital identity here at the WTO. Would be a great opportunity.
Just to add a very brief point, I fully endorse what has been said about the WTO being the ideal forum to have discussions on how we can design greater interoperable systems cross-border. Another approach that Singapore has taken is that we have worked with like-minded countries to develop digital economy agreements, and these agreements enable a group of like-minded countries to develop common approaches and standards, and we have been growing our network of digital economy agreements to facilitate cross-border connectivity and digital trade. So that is another way by which countries can work together at a faster pace, of course, to enhance interoperability across borders.
I should know what disagreements are because I'm sure at some point I read a briefing paper about it. But and maybe I don't want to go down this particular rabbit hole. But is this issues of trust in where the data is going, or how, or who you trust the data to go to, or maybe we don't want to go down this particular rabbit hole, but you can add a little bit.
Your question is about how do we engender trust across borders?
Or is that what the agreements are trying to facilitate?
Yes, of course, because the agreements will address issues such as data sharing, digital identity, electronic payments, and once this group of like-minded countries have reached agreement on some of these key elements, then it does facilitate interoperability across borders. So, for example, Singapore has already established cross-border e-payment with Malaysia, I think with Thailand, and I think possibly with India as well. Believe it or not.
All right. One question, this may be a little bit beyond, and it's not really a WTO issue, but it's something that as I think about these issues and as I was doing some reading about this in preparation, to me, digital necessarily implies, and for these things to operate, that you have a internet, broadband, access in country for these things to work digitally. Again, not necessarily a WTO issue, but any comments or anything where there can be conversations, or there can be, again, ideas for fostering, ecosystems that help with that, and whoever wants to go.
You're entirely right. I mean, DPI is not operating in a vacuum. We need to be connected if you want to be able to use the digital solutions. And we do know that there is a big connectivity gap. In low-income economies, only about 20% of the population is connected, while in high-income economies, virtually everybody is connected. The IMF has estimated that there are $418 billion that are necessary to bring connectivity to unconnected populations. So yes, we do have a big digital divide that needs to be addressed. Now, in terms of connectivity, accessing the internet, in terms of bandwidth as well, because when you have access to the internet in certain regions, the bandwidth may be very, very limited. In terms of skills as well, to be able to use these solutions. Now, there's a lot of work being done at the international level to try and address this digital divide. A number of international organizations have programs in place. At the WTO, we've also partnered with other international organizations. So we have, for example, partnered with the World Bank in the context of a project called Digital Trade for Africa, where we did gap analysis studies, including in terms of connectivity, and we're now moving to the implementation phase in 6 pilot countries in Africa, and it's being extended to Latin America and the Caribbean in cooperation with the Inter-American Development Bank. There's also a fund with the International Trade Center, which helps women exporters build their digital skills so that they can trade more and better. So we are trying to work with other organizations to help in that respect. It's a huge endeavor, of course, but you're right, yes, DPI doesn't happen in the vacuum, so we need to solve that first.
Now, I would like to open the floor for any questions. Identify yourself and pose your question.
My name is Martin Smeets, and I used to work here at the WTO for quite a number of years, and independent and working as an academic. Yes, I've listened with great interest to all the suggestions, ideas that have been put forward, in particular with the issue of interoperability between systems. And the examples that we heard from Ambassador Tan, which are very inspiring, that is to work together with like-minded countries. I think and we heard also about the risk of digital divide. It's great to work with like-minded countries, but the risk is to have systems that are maybe different amongst the continents, based on different legal structures, based on different economic interests. We know that some areas, some regions focus more on business interests, others, like in Europe, more on the consumer. In China and Asia, it's maybe again different. Well, it is again different. So how can you ensure that in the end you don't create fragmentation in systems, that this interoperability, difficult word, anyway, I'll try it again. In any case, how can you ensure that there is some homogeneity between that it's going to be compatible? Because we see more and more initiatives at the regional level on the different continents. How can you make sure that in the end there will be not a fragmented system where there will be competing systems based on different legal systems? Simple question.
Yeah, maybe part of the solution, anyways. I think there's something to be said for standards, right? And this again is a broader concept, but building systems that rely on international standards that are used and the same all around the world. That's a great starting point, right? And you're starting from scratch, or you're starting from a shared base, and then you can build from there the specific implementation. So it seems like standards are part of the solution to that problem.
That's a very good question, but the honest answer is that at this juncture, you cannot guarantee that there will be global harmonization. First, because the digital transformation is evolving at such a rapid pace. If we were to wait until everybody in the world is ready to move, we will miss the boat. So I think the fundamental approach here is let not perfect be the enemy of the good. Whatever we can do with like-minded group of countries, we should move ahead. And then at some point, when there is sufficient critical mass, then possibly the WTO would be the appropriate forum to bring about global harmonization. But I don't see that day on the horizon in the near future.
I may bring a nuance of semantic into the discussion. And we can aim for harmonization, frankly. I think that's pretty challenging, difficult, will take very long time. But we can also use fora like WTO to try and align approaches or ensure compatibility. And it's not exactly the same as harmonization, but it does help to reduce fragmentation. So that would be
I would just also, something you said just triggered in my mind. Transparency is always good, and if you know, even if it's just the WTO is just a place where you convene to discuss what's happening and why, and whether there are ways of making things more interoperable, then that's a function that the WTO can do. Sure. Vic, do you have a quick follow-up, or?
It was a follow-up question.
Sure, go ahead.
I thought maybe part of the answer, or one element of the answer, would be that some of the key elements that are in the JSI would allow actually for that harmonized approach that you mentioned yourselves, that are key elements in the JSI, like data protection, e-payment. So I thought that maybe that will be a starting point for having discussions on some common elements, and then you have at least, when you talk about standards, minimum standards from where you can build, because I know that already in the JSI on e-commerce, some of those standards that have been brought down in the discussions, but that could be a starting point for building on, if you don't want to use the word harmonization, but for some common understanding as a minimum basis from where to start.
Excellent point. The back.
Thank you very much. Sorry, another question, but this time from a serving WTO secretary, if you allow me. Emmanuelle, you mentioned this paper on DPI that EU issued on 2022. You're far too bashful to mention that you are actually moderating a session tomorrow afternoon that will update and give further information about that. But I would encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to go to that session tomorrow that you will be looking at. If you allow me to follow up on that and maybe ask a further question, one of the sort of the real benefits that seems to come from the rollout is formalization of economic activity. So the moment you have a digital identity, suddenly you have a track of all of the payments. You may not have necessarily a track of the goods being sold, but you certainly have a track of the payments. And that seems to be of incredible benefit for for developing countries, and the vast majority of our membership is obviously developing countries. On the issue of connectivity and the digital divide, I think important to bring into this context is the issue of affordability of connection. It's not necessarily that the connection doesn't exist, but now there's the issue of affordability, particularly now when you think about innovations related to, say, for example, satellite systems. And if you allow me just a final, squeeze in a final point, one dimension to this that also seems to be important is putting this in the domestic regulatory context, is to have the necessary training available for the enforcement of competition policy through courts, through judges, through legal systems. And there I wonder whether Singapore, being so far advanced in this area, can maybe give us some ideas as to how they've been able to train their legal system to be able to apply the legal principles within this digital environment. Thank you.
That's a very specific question about how we have been able to train our legal service to keep pace with digital transformation. But fortunately, I have my legal counselor here. Maybe she can answer the question.
She'll write you a briefing memo.
Thank you, Ambassador. So perhaps I guess in a very brief way, in Singapore there is this continual learning requirement. So all lawyers, judges included, are part of this framework where we need to continuously upgrade our skills, and then this is where if there are digitization of new things, or where there are new laws or new rules, lawyers and judges will also sign up for these courses because there's a mandatory requirement of a certain number of hours per year. So that's how the lawyers in Singapore keep up to date with the changes. Thank you.
But I would also think that, again, you've led the legal, the regulatory system to allow for, again, digital signatures and all that, and that is probably based on some of the, again, we were talking about kind of the base level standards, if you want to call it that, standards, not in the technical sense, but this is the minimum that you need in order to foster, DPI to thrive. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Sandy. I'm the chair for the ASEAN Business Alliance. This question is for the ambassador. Singapore has championed the development of very trusted and also interoperable digital public infrastructure through initiatives like WITA and its collaboration with the ASEAN partners and also India. So from your perspective, what safeguards or policy frameworks have proven to be most essential or crucial to ensure that the DPI is not only scalable across different borders, but also supports the less digitally advanced economies?
I think when we get together with like-minded countries to embark on either on the digital economy agreement, in a way that process is self-selecting. You identify partners who share your interest, who have similar level of development in terms of their digital public infrastructure. So that process of self-selection would ensure that our DEA, Digital Economy Agreement partners, will be more or less be on the same page. The second part of your question is how we can provide assistance to less advanced, in the words, countries to help narrow the digital gap. I think that is done through a variety of ways. Like in the case of Singapore, we have the Singapore Cooperation Program, whereby we have placed a huge emphasis on training or we provide training to help fellow developing countries in the areas of digital transformation, digital literacy. So that is undertaken individually by countries. Hope that answers the question.
First, person to my left, and then the person on the right.
Thank you. I'm Pilar Pajames from WITA, and I have a kind of three interrelated questions. I have a basic existential conceptual question, because I am a kind of a definitions freak, and in a way, you talk about approach, but I'm working on digital public infrastructure, and even if the G20 kind of agreed to a consensus, everyone is using DPI definition in a different way. So for me, actually, I have a problem even to see digital identity, digital payments, and data exchanges as infrastructure, because then it complicates the thing, confusing with digital infrastructure, which is really what we talk here about connectivity and these things. For me, this is introducing a conflicting concept. The second thing, and in this case, for example, including data exchanges, maybe this interoperability that we are talking is calling in a different way cross-border, free cross-border data flows. Is this a kind of old wine in new bottles? So this is one thing. And another thing I wanted to say is that the DPI is also being debated very much in the context of the UN, on the broader context that you discussed about digital governance, and is quite a part of that. So how do you link what we are saying here, that nothing has been said on what is happening at the overall UN level?
Maybe just one point. The responsibility is part of the question. I think, from my perspective, there are different roles for different organizations when we're talking about DPI, and I think this is the case with a lot of concepts. But to my mind, this conversation on DPI within the WTO, if it attempts to cover every single topic that's relevant to DPI, it's probably not going to be a successful approach. That's not the role of the WTO, and I don't think that's the way that conversation should be. So I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing that you have different organizations talking about the same general concept if they are focused on the segment of it that makes sense for the mission of the organization. That said, these should be coordinated, right? In an ideal world, it wouldn't be that there's one type of conversation happening in the UN and then a completely different conversation in the WTO. They should make sense together. that's difficult, I understand, and especially when we're talking about something with a lot of big ideas, like all the things we've been talking about on this panel today. So I would just say, I see a role for the WTO to be active on DPI. That is not the same as the WTO does everything on DPI. So I think it's worth saying, do something, but do it in a WTO sense that makes, that's how you advance this conversation in a helpful way. Anybody else?
Thank you very much. My name is Tapiwa Choka. I used to work for the African Union Commission on Digital Trade, and now with ITC. I think my question is for those countries that have not developed DPI as yet, that possibly want to develop DPI. Is there somewhat of a linear approach that countries can take? I think basically I'm trying to say that with the movement of digital technologies, the movement of digital technologies, if we let the government take lead with regards to the development of digital public infrastructure, it may take a bit of a while for the infrastructure to be fully developed, whilst we also have the private sector which can move at lightning speed. But of course, if they move at lightning speed without the necessary guardrails, the regulations, etc., it may be quite a further challenge going forward. So I don't know if any of you have some thought, maybe KT, Dr. Kelly has got some thoughts going very soon.
Yeah, it's a really great question as to how to sequence this and these systems in less developed economies. I would say, well, we need to, of course, have the fundamentals that the panel has discussed. We need to have the connectivity for people to actually use these systems, and certain, trust and affinity with digital services that many economies in Africa there of course is increasingly, and for people to be able to then take these systems up. We have actually seen some of our empirical work is that economies like Thailand, like Brazil, like Singapore, Costa Rica, where there has been an uptake of DPIs in terms of digital payments, those economies already had a lot of digital transactions with other systems. So that affinity is very important. And if it's not there, if the usage is still not there, I think what the ambassador alluded to was kind of digital literacy, enabling people to use these tools and test them out will be very important. And then, of course, as you build these out, something that the panel has been alluding to all along is that bringing the private sector along. If government leads this, we need to have, of course, the regulatory and policy infrastructure in place, but also from the very beginning, build the private sector applications into these systems and ensure that they are truly interoperable from the beginning. I think that's also important because it's harder to then reverse engineer something that has been built. So that would be on my side, just thinking about some of the sequencing. Of course, depends on the economy question, but there's a lot of great examples also in Africa, as well as around the world on how economies have accomplished this. So I would look to those. So.
Thank you. Since we're almost at time, I'm just going to ask the panelists if they have final thoughts, final ideas, and I'm going to start to my left, Kyle, and then we'll go down the lane.
I would just say I've enjoyed this panel. I think it's great that this conversation is happening in the WTO, and it sounds like there will be additional conversations on this topic tomorrow. So I think it's important. I think it's worth spending time thinking about these issues in the WTO, and look forward to being part of the discussion going forward. Thank you.
I think what this discussion shows is that there is much more to discuss, and so we're at the beginning of this journey, even though DPIs have been in place for some time now. But good to see that this is being brought to the WTO, and look forward to discussing further.
Well, just to say that what this discussion demonstrates is that the digital transformation is real, and every country must get ourselves ready, embrace it, and do not miss the wave.
Yeah, to me there is a lot of research that needs to still take place to compare these different systems to one another and really understand are we getting to where we want to go? And I think where we want to go is that consumers are actually using these systems. You know, oftentimes we talk in big terms, but the empirical work really has to happen. Are consumers using it different segments of the population? Are businesses using these systems, for instance, accepting payments through DPIs? Is there this choice that consumers of businesses have, and are they truly better off as a result? And then, is there access to a number of services like Michael alluded to? Once you have a digital ID, well, does that actually enable you to do a number of things in the society? Does that make you better off? I think there's a lot of empirical work that needs to happen to compare and contrast across systems in an impartial way, without taking sides, and then see what systems are actually working for different kinds of economies.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I've learned a lot, and I over to Ken.
Thank you, Maria, Ambassador Ken, Emmanuelle, Kyle, and Kati. Thank you so much for joining us. WITA is glad to have been able to host this conversation. Thanks to our partners at ITI who helped us conceive this panel, and our friends at the National Foreign Trade Council who are also here. Thank you to the panel and